Welcome everyone to Biotech Speak for 2023 with Seismic. This is going to be a primer of key terms for academics or early career industry scientists who are either looking to enter industry jobs or someone who's just wanting to learn a little bit more about different types of industry jobs through the terminology. Before we get into the presentation, I want to introduce everyone who's on the call today. I'm Erin from Seismic. I'm the Scientific Outreach Specialist. And today we actually have Elizabeth Wu, one of the co-founders of Seismic, on the call. And she's going to say a little bit about what led her to found Seismic.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth. I'm very excited to be here. When I first started Seismic, I was in academia and I noticed how challenging it was for scientists to find jobs that fit their specialized skill sets and also to understand job descriptions and the language that companies were using to describe what they needed in their candidates and their hires. So this was a huge inefficiency in the hiring process. And my co-founder, Danica, and I really wanted to make this process more efficient so scientists could land in jobs where they could use their skills and their strengths and really make an impact where they were. So we founded Seismic to match people to the right roles in companies so that they could propel innovation and work on products toward commercialization.
Yeah, and to that end, we have kind of a two-pronged approach. So there's a skills-based job matching. If you're looking for a job right now, I encourage you to check out seismic.com/scientists. Fill out a profile, and it will suggest open roles for you that match your skill set. You'll also get access to professional development, like free resume feedback, and really anything you want. Once you're a user, you can always for free reach out to us and ask for advice. If there's a role you're considering, you're not sure that you're a good fit for or not, if there's a term in a job description that you don't know if anyone else could answer, we're always happy to help. Part of that also is career development programming, like this event, where we're going to go through biotech terminology. So this event is kind of a merging of what we do best, the industry terminology matching and the acting as a guide into first industry positions. Now to go over what we'll cover today. Divided this into different types of terms that we'll cover. We're going to start with job titles and what you can figure out from those. Go into the regulatory terms, which I think are some of the most fun because they really inform you about the drug development process in industry. Go into different company types that you might encounter. And then close the presentation portion with kind of catch-all of miscellaneous terms that we didn't want to leave off, but that didn't really fit into the other three categories. I hope we have plenty of time for Elizabeth to also answer questions from the chat of terminology that you would like to find. But I think the obvious question here is, though, why care? They're just words at the end of the day. But these words can tell us a lot in a job description on a company website about the skills that an employer is particularly going to find attractive in an applicant, about the responsibilities that the role is going to entail, even things they're not specifically laying out in the job description. And it can tell you a lot about the company, including the type that they are. Particularly interesting is the stage that they're at with the product and what kind of product they're producing. These are in addition to the general industry insight you get from the terms. As I mentioned, what the drug development process looks like, what the goals of industry are. I'm going to start with job titles. The advertising for the event, you might have seen discovery biology, discovery biologist, scientist, discovery biology. These are titles that you're going to see more and more. It fits a particular part of the drug discovery process where it's very early on. You're looking at potential drug targets that you could look at and doing a high throughput testing, looking at what phenotypes you get in those tests. The whole goal of this is to identify an initial target to take into R&D as a whole and to optimize into a product. As you might guess, roles that are looking for this are either Very early on, they have products in the discovery phase. They likely don't have one specific product that they're focusing on all of their energy that they're going to take and run with. But you might also see it with very, very large companies. When you see this, it typically means a new area that the company is looking at. Maybe they're starting to branch out into a new area that they were not initially focusing on. The skills for roles, you're going to be a really good match for these roles if you've done translational research, either with in vivo assays or in vitro assays, or you have an interest in doing this kind of early translational research. Past R&D, you get into manufacturing roles, and two that you'll see a lot are upstream process development and downstream process development. They're very different, and they're looking for very different skills, even though they serve the same general flow of the manufacturing process. Upstream is early on. It's using these large industrial bioreactors to grow biomolecules using cells. As you can imagine, the top skills they're going to be looking for these roles is experience with stable cell lines. They're mammalian cell cultures or different types of microbial cell cultures, bacterial cell cultures, E. coli, but also yeast culture is going to be very interesting for these roles. Sterile technique, if you're very comfortable working with large amounts of cells, different types of cells without contaminating them. Those are good skills to have for these roles. Companies looking for these types of roles are typically going to be working with biomolecular products, and they're doing manufacturing. Similar companies, biomolecule products, manufacturing, but downstream is the second half of this manufacturing process. This role is responsible for actually harvesting the product and purifying the drug substances for getting the highest yield, the highest quality at the lowest cost. Skills they're looking for here are going to be very different. They're going to be looking for a lot of skills that are generally analytical chemistry, many types of chromatography skills, filtration experience. Those are going to be highly sought after for these types of roles. Going a little bit further, even thinking about getting a product into market, roles that you might seem a little confusing at first because of how similar they are. Product manager and product development. They seem very similar on the face, but they are different. The product manager is going to use data and customer feedback, essentially market research, to define the ideal product requirements. What you want to think of here is the product manager is defining what a product should be. Skills here are going to be less of the wet lab skills and more of the transferable skills that you bring from your academic experience or you bring from other work experience. Communication skills, the ability to synthesize large amounts of data to create a plan to move forward. Those are going to be highly valuable. But when you think of your research skills, you have to also think of product experience. If it's an antibody company and you've utilized antibodies in your research, you're going to be very well equipped to understand and communicate with the customers who are going to be using the product, because you know what you like and expect out of an antibody. You have a strong place to start for understanding the future customer's mindset. So in addition to those transferable skills, experience with the product is also very useful. Companies that have this, they're starting to think about market. So they usually have at least an initial product in mind. They're usually past that initial discovery lead optimization stage. Product development, like I said, is similar, but remember I said product manager, think what a product should be. Product development, think a little bit about what a product will be. This one's taking that kind of information to then influence product design and prototyping, evaluation, and then finally to launch. Skills for this are again going to be transferable skills, but you're going to be working with a lot of different teams. You're going to be communicating a lot of different objectives. So communication a lot of comfort with speaking with different kinds of scientific experts. That kind of broad foundation of scientific knowledge as well as product knowledge is going to be helpful. And if you're comfortable problem solving in real time with efficiency. Similar though to product manager, usually these companies are going to have an initial product in mind that they want to really develop and bring to market. Going back to manufacturing, similar to the product manager, product development, ones that are sometimes used really interchangeably are quality control and quality assurance. You might have even seen situations where it's QC/QA, but they're actually pretty different. Quality control is focused on products. It's focused on assuring the quality of the final manufactured batches and products. You can think of this as taking examples of products as they're rolling off the line and making sure that they're meeting all of the requirements, that there's no obvious defects, and also that any variability in the product is kept to a minimum. Skills that might make you a good fit for this role or might be indicative that you would enjoy a role like this is experience with assay development and then the interpretation of data that you get from the assay, especially if it's an assay that you've developed yourself or semi-independently in your lab. You've been the leader on the project. Companies doing this are almost always doing some level of manufacturing. Quality assurance, on the other hand, is not product focused, it's process focused. Instead of looking at, for example, what's coming off the quote unquote conveyor belt, they're looking at all the steps along the conveyor belt. And they're looking that the processes are operating according to the design and that the variability of the processes are being kept to a minimum. And that all of the manufacturing protocols are being followed. Instead of necessarily assay development, developing methods, if you've written SOPs, can be helpful, but also if you have some interest in process improvement. And you have to be very, very detail oriented to enjoy this type of role. But like quality control, manufacturing is typically the general types of companies that are looking for these roles. My favorite part, the regulatory language. As I said, for the regulatory language, it tells you a lot about not only the drug development pipeline, but also differences between medical device companies versus drug companies versus biologics. Starting with CLIA, Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments. These are regulations for testing that apply to labs that are testing human samples. The interesting thing about this is what it tells you about the type of companies. Companies that are looking for these are almost always diagnostics companies rather than specifically R&D companies. They might be R&D if they're looking at LDTs, laboratory developed tests, but typically they're going to be labs that primarily run diagnostics rather than trying to bring a product to market. Skills for here are going to be experience with sample collection, sample ascensioning, tissue harvest. Some states are going to look for clinical certification, clinical laboratory certification, but not all. So if you see a role you're interested in that is looking for this, it might be worthwhile to ask them if you don't have a clinical laboratory certification, if it's required for the role or not. Good laboratory practice, or GLP, is always an interesting one to me because I know it sounds so general. It's like if you've done wet lab work, you assume, yeah, I have good lab practice. I label my reagents. I keep my bench top clean and uncluttered. I know where all my samples are and I have a record of them. But GLP actually refers specifically to regulations for data collection, monitoring, and the type of instrumentation that you need to collect data in the preclinical stage. Which we'll talk a little bit about what preclinical specifically refers to a little later. Skills that they're going to look for here is going to be animal toxicology experience, and some interest or prior experience with regulations. You don't always need to have regulatory experience, but knowing what these terms are, doing some research under the FDA website of the specific requirements for GLP is going to help you stand out in an interview and show your interest. cGMP, current good manufacturing practice, similar to GLP, these are regulations, but they apply to manufacturing. They assure that there's proper design, monitoring, and control of the processes. An interest in the manufacturing, and again, the interest in regulations specifically for these are going to be skills that help you stand out in an interview. Companies looking for this are typically going to be doing manufacturing, but they're going to either be contract organizations, which we'll get into, or they might be companies doing this in-house, but they're scaling, which we'll also cover. Essentially, they're growing. Getting into the regulatory documents is where we can start to see some of the differences between drugs versus device. Because you have IND, the investigational new drug, or an IDE, investigational device exemption. It's going to be a data packet that's compiled and submitted to the FDA. This is what the data that goes into this is what you're gathering in that preclinical stage. If all the data shows that there's not a strong risk to humans and that there's good reason that the drug or device might be beneficial and it should be taken into clinical trials, then it can be approved to be used in humans in clinical trials. For roles looking for this, you want to check out the FDA website and look at the specifics of what each of these require. For example, how much of the way that the drug is being manufactured, the conditions it's being manufactured under, how much of that needs to be included in the IND, what kind of toxicology data, and under what conditions do you need to collect them. Companies looking for this, though, are almost always looking to move into clinical trials. They're almost certainly in that preclinical stage, and they're hoping to move into human research soon. BLA, Biologics License Application, is something interesting that applies to biologics along with this IND stage. When you're moving into clinical trials, often requires transportation of the product that you're testing. If this product is something like a vaccine or cell and gene therapy, a blood product, that requires an additional BLA to be transported across state lines. So that tells you a lot about the type of product that they're likely looking at, and again, the stage that they're likely looking to move into this clinical trial stage. They've likely either submitted an IND or are looking to submit one shortly. Now, an NDA is further along. I won't say that it's the end of the line because there is quite a lot of post-market monitoring as well. But the NDA is typically what you're going to think of when people say something is FDA approved. It's an application for sale and marketing of the drug product in the US. It's only issued after the clinical trial data. It's another large data packet with a fairly lengthy review looking at the benefits of it and any adverse risks, as well as the way the drug is going to be labeled and marketed. In any role looking for this, you want to look up the full list of what goes into the NDA. Companies looking for this are going to be looking to move into the clinical trial stage and move from the clinical trial stage into market. If you look at this 3 to 10 years for clinical trials, they're probably close to the end of this stage for at least one of the products that they're looking at for. Going back to medical devices, you have the PMA, pre-market approval. Medical devices are kind of confusing because they don't all follow the same long approval process that drugs do. There's only certain classes of ones, this class 3, which go through the heavy regulatory application process. Class 3 are essentially ones that either are very novel, they don't have a pre-existing equivalent, or they present a strong risk for harm, or they are considered life-sustaining. If they fail, it's likely to be fatal. These ones require the PMA to actually be marketed in the US, and they require that kind of safety human data that all of the drugs require. Companies looking for this, almost assuredly a medical device company, and they're likely looking to move a device to market very soon. Moving to types of companies. Mentioned a couple times preclinical, non-clinical, and the role of the preclinical in the IND. You've probably seen a lot of startups describe themselves in job descriptions as we're preclinical stage. What this means is they likely have a product that they are looking to focus on, to run with. And what they're doing is these preclinical proof of concept studies for the therapeutic lead to then further develop it and to collect data under the requirements of the IND, under these GLP practices, to submit to move into clinical trials eventually. As you can guess, this would require a lot of toxicology, a lot of in vivo studies. So skills they're looking for are going to be experience with in vivo studies, and especially relevant, especially interesting would be some understanding of pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics. CROs, contract research organizations, these where we get to go a little bit more into those contract organizations I mentioned a little bit in the manufacturing side. Contract research organizations are organizations where companies can outsource some parts of their R&D, typically R&D process. CROs, typically lab-based. When you get into manufacturing, typically that's going to be the organization we talk about next. So these companies, they are doing a lot of R&D research, but they're not doing their own projects. They're taking on multiple projects from other organizations. So you might be interested in this type of organization if you have an interest in multiple fields of study. The idea of working on several different projects with different areas of research or expertise needed. That would be especially enticing. But broadly, they would be interested in anyone with R&D skills that they are confident in. For manufacturing, CDMOs, contract development and manufacturing organizations, they're typically the ones that are going to handle that. They're essentially outsource options for the drug development process. They can help with formulation, blending, but also the packaging. It's very manufacturing focused. So we go back to those skills they're looking for things like upstream, downstream. Those are skills they're going to be looking for. Experience with the process development skills, but also the QC, QA. Those could also fall under roles that these organizations would be hiring for. But again, like CROs, multiple projects, not just one, but rather than being very supportive of R&D outsourcing, they're supportive of the manufacturing. The miscellaneous terms. Incubator, when you're interviewing with startups and you're asking about where they're headquartered, what the work environment is like, you might hear, oh, we work out of an incubator. Incubator is a common lab space where space can be rented on essentially a per bench basis for very early stage startups. So typically who you're going to find here. Basically, any skills a startup could want would apply to working at an incubator space. R&D skills, but you're also working with small teams, but teams that need to be very cohesive typically, and typically startups. So being able to display teamwork, they're typically in the decision-making phase of determining what product to run with. So abilities for data analysis and making decisions off that data is going to be very helpful. The interesting thing to note about incubators is you're likely not going to be just working around people from your company. In that same building, you're also going to have scientists, engineers who are working for multiple different companies. So it's a good place to network, to get to know what other people are working on, to really quickly immerse yourself in the industry. A lot of times, large incubators will also offer free programming for employees. Manufacturing, I mentioned the need to scale up for companies. Scale up essentially just means that you're increasing production capacity for the drug that you're working on, for the product that you're working on, biologic. You need to scale up essentially every time you're going from the research phase to preclinical stage to clinical trial stage to then into market. You need to be able to produce more and more within budget and with a high degree of quality. So companies looking for this kind of experience they're typically growing from one of these stages to another. You might have to ask them, you might have to infer a little bit from the public announcements of the company, what specific stage they're moving from, but looking for experience or an interest in supporting scaling up typically means the company is in a growth phase. Looking at contract organizations, you might also see a need for statement of work. This is essentially just an outline of a project scope. It's where the company that's contracting with the CRO, CDMO, or some other vendor is laying out the time frame that they need, the estimated cost, and the deliverables that they're going to need. And it's an agreement to contract between the two. So if you're looking for what you might gain from working with a company that's dealing with this a lot, you would get a lot of experience with skills in vendor management. Design of experiments, another kind of confusing one, like good laboratory practice. I think we've all designed experiments, but design of experiments is specifically referring in industry to a type of process improvement and refinement, specifically a statistical method where you're trying to reduce the number of trial runs and expenses that you need in your R&D phase. Skills you'll gain here would be experience using factorial designs for this, and also that process improvement and refinement. Most of the companies using this, anyone who at large scale is doing research and development. So independent research and development companies, but also CROs that are supporting research and development. LIMS is something that most companies are going to mention. It's a laboratory information management system. It's just a support software for the laboratory operations. It's a way to keep track of all your samples. It's a way to keep track of the instruments that are available. It's a way to essentially run the whole lab at a glance. If the lab is somewhat automated, that can also go through the LIMS system as well. Even if you don't have specifically LIMS experience with the type of laboratory management like sample management, instrument management, that's going to be very beneficial to focus on. But also looking at examples of LIMS systems could be as well. Benchling is just one example of one that's available. As I said, in industry, most companies are going to be utilizing some form of this. So now I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth, and I'm going to ask her questions from the chat. Even though we've got some ready to go, please type in any that you still have. I want to make sure that no one's leaving without the term that they want defined.